Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. All right, today we've got a video that should provide some context for one of the geopolitical situations you've probably heard about, and that's between the country of China and Taiwan. This video comes from SideQuest, and they call it, "Why Didn't China Conquer Taiwan?" I'm assuming here that they are specifically talking about after the Civil War in 1949, and the nationalist government flees basically to Taiwan, and the mainland not going after them in Taiwan. Because there are times in history where China has conquered and ruled Taiwan. For example, in the 17th century with the Ming Dynasty. But we'll see what we got here. Original video is linked down below. Make sure you're supporting SideQuest. By the way, if you didn't know, we've started an alternate history series, and our second video just came out this week. And the hypothetical question is, what if Trotsky instead of Stalin became the leader of the Soviet Union after the death of Lenin? A lot of work went into it. I'll link it down below. I think you'll enjoy it. All right, let's check this out.
Taiwan.
Hello.
That small island off the coast of China that's been giving its communist neighbors a very big headache. You'd be forgiven for thinking that the Taiwan problem is relatively new, a leftover from the Chinese Civil War and the Cold War that followed. But truth be told, China's troubles with Taiwan began much earlier, albeit in a surprisingly similar form. To be clear, for most of its history, China didn't even want Taiwan. In the eyes of the Tang, Song, and Yuan dynasties, Taiwan was a barbarian backwater.
Because you got mainland China, and anything kind of seen outside of that sphere was viewed that way going back to ancient times. So Tang, Song, Yuan dynasty, that's the Mongols. So for that, you're talking about just before the 1000s, and then up to, 1300s, mid 1300s. Then you're going to get the Ming and the Qing. But with the Qing in the 1600s, they do take it over. But yeah, it's a long period of time that they didn't. And because of that, Taiwan had its own identity, right? Its own sort of indigenous people and culture and language.
Inhabited by various dynasties, Taiwan was a barbarian backwater, inhabited by various Austronesian peoples and the occasional Chinese pirate or fisherman. It is in this sorry state of affairs that the Portuguese first found Taiwan around the year 1542.
We called Formosa for a while.
Unlike the Chinese, the Portuguese liked the island so much that they called it Formosa, or Beautiful Island.
So the Portuguese, they were the first of the Europeans to sail into this area, around Africa, into the Indian Ocean, then over to China. And they really want to open up these trade markets here. Now, we'll see if they get to or not, but the Chinese were very kind of reluctant to offer a lot of permanence of the Portuguese and other Europeans in their country. They traded with a lot of restrictions. The Portuguese also did trade with Japan for a while until that got, very quickly closed off by the Tokugawa. But yeah, trying to, you could really see as Formosa kind of as kind of like a trading hub for that area of kind of East China Sea in that region. Good geographic location for that stuff.
Though they weren't able to establish any settlements. It was the Dutch who first laid claim to Taiwan by building an outpost on its southwestern edge.
I didn't know they went up that far north. You hear about the Dutch in Indonesia. Now, one thing the Dutch did do was hijacked, I guess you could say in a lot of ways, of the places that the Portuguese had conquered and kind of boot them out, especially around the 1600s. That's when the Dutch were really kicking it with their empire. Killing it, I should say.
One by building an outpost on its southwestern edge, quickly followed by the Spanish, who occupied a strip of coast up north. This cozy arrangement didn't last very long. After all, sharing was never a European strong suit.
The Dutch guy's got the Dutch East India Company logo in there. The most valuable company that has ever existed. Insane. You put all the major Apples and Google and all that stuff, you can pretty much add them up and, not even get to the Dutch. Dutch East India Company is crazy.
And so the Dutch kicked the Spanish out in 1642, just in time for the rapid collapse of the Ming Dynasty against invading Manchus from the north.
those the Ming who take over from the Mongols are the ones are going to be, they said conquered by the Qing, or sorry, the Manchus. Those are who the Qing dynasty is going to be. And that's going to be the final dynasty of China, by the way, in their history. Because after that, they're going to go to a weak republic and then, get invaded. Of course, I mean, by then the Qing were done, but invaded by Japan. Then you get civil war, and then, the communist leadership we have today.
In a very blunt foreshadowing of things to come, the loyalists of the now deposed Ming Dynasty fled from the victorious Manchus on the mainland to Taiwan.
I didn't know that either.
1661 onwards.
Interesting. So Taiwan, because it's famous about the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek, leaving and basically fleeing after the Civil War and Mao Zedong and the communist takeover. It looks like, I guess there's a history of this. This is where you go and you flee mainland China. It's like an island of exiles. Interesting. I did not know that.
On the mainland to Taiwan from 1661 onwards, kicking out our Dutch friends in the process. But the Manchus weren't able to invade Taiwan immediately in pursuit. They were, after all, steppe nomads with no naval experience to speak of.
True.
Instead, they ordered the entire southern coast of China to be evacuated at least 15 kilometers inland. Close to 1 million people were forcibly displaced to prevent any trade with Taiwan and to starve out the Ming holdouts with questionable results. What isn't questionable, though, is the free online PvP strategy game of our dear friends, Supremacy World War III.
What?
Experience
there was a World War
exhilarating real-time combat
in Florida?
In the 20th and 21st centuries by leading your country against up to 99 other players in persistent week-long matches.
The
Build
Chinese?
a powerful war economy, expand your military, forge alliances, and wage war to conquer the world.
Oh, they want Algeria?
You can play with your friends across PC and mobile, just in time for Season 17, set in a global nuclear winter with scarce resources. And as a special courtesy for SideQuest viewers, you'll receive a unique starter pack with a free Elite Bomber seasonal unit worth $25 if you download the game using the link in the description within 30 days. So download Supremacy World War III for free today and lead your army to
Not Switzerland!
Dominate World War III for free today and lead your army.
Oh! Someone's nuking the Swiss! Dude, they don't mess with anyone, man. Oh no.
To world domination. But back to our original story. The new Qing dynasty ended up having to invade Taiwan anyway, which they only managed to do 20 years later after building up their navy.
So their strategy, so that they couldn't invade it, but they just boycotted all trade with them, hoping that they would die. I hadn't heard of this movement. I didn't know much even about the Qing and kind of how they necessarily conquered Taiwan. I just kind of knew roughly the context of when it happened. So I still have so many questions with this.
They only managed to do 20 years later after building up their navy.
Okay.
And so in 1683,
you're gonna have to have a navy eventually.
China invaded Taiwan with over 200 ships and won one of the largest naval battles of the 17th century.
So this is still kind of the holdouts from the Ming, kind of holding on to what they have over there. Okay. This would be the difference in the comparison between the nationalist government of the 20th century and the Mao Zedong government. Difference being that here, it was Qing versus Ming, and the Qing actually do go after the power structure that survived from the Ming Dynasty and take over that region, where that doesn't happen in the 20th century with the communists over Taiwan. Now, there are some reasons. We'll see if they get to that, especially because Taiwan also has incredible foreign support. As one of the allies of World War II, the Chiang Kai-shek nationalist government had the support of the United States, for example. And we'll see if they mention that, because that's an enormously important aspect here.
Taiwan's rebel regime was definitively ended, and the island was, for the first time, in formal Chinese possession. But now that they had it, the Qing weren't quite sure what to do with Taiwan. Many in the imperial court pushed
Start
for it
making
to be abandoned,
superconductors and micro
as it
computer
was,
chips.
by all accounts, a poor backwater with minimal economic and cultural value. The military argued fiercely to keep Taiwan after bleeding so much to occupy it.
Right.
And this was
don't want it to
indeed
be a
what the emperor decided
waste.
to do, but under strict conditions.
What?
Taiwan was to be integrated into China as a prefecture, but with heavy restrictions on settler migration.
Now, prefectures are basically states, right? Is that the best term, would you say, to like for an American in the United States to say? When I hear about prefecture, I usually think of like states, you know, like semi-autonomous, but still maybe still under the governance of a larger, you know, government here. But it looks like restricted settler migration, they're saying here. Would that be by the Chinese, though, of they don't want a lot of Chinese people moving there, or other foreigners?
China as a prefecture, but with heavy restrictions on settler migration. In this way,
What types of settlers?
foreigners couldn't use it as an outpost, and it would be too depopulated to serve as a rebel base.
Okay.
Taiwan would remain as this frontier military-occupied territory for the next 2 centuries.
I guess that makes sense. It's kind of like a forward operating, almost like Navy base for, for the ocean over there. Maybe its most, useful capacity there.
Producing over 100 separate rebellions, so much so that the Qing had a proverb about it. But while the Qing
Wait, what'd that say?
much so that the Qing had a proverb about it.
Every 3 years, an uprising. Every 5 years, a rebellion. It's one of those things where you have to figure out, is it worth keeping or not?
But while the Qing were busy putting down rebellions,
We know
the
Japan's gonna be
Japanese were
interested.
getting down and dirty with industrialization.
Yep.
They beat up the Qing so badly with their new modernized army that China handed over Taiwan, the Liaodong Peninsula, and their supposed suzerainty over Korea, which we discussed in another recent SideQuest, to Japan.
It's good. Yeah, I think it's often kind of forgotten that in the Sino-Japanese War, which, again, they are kind of competing over Korea being kind of a tributary state at time of China, also seeing its independence. Fortunately for Korea, going to be sandwiched between China and Japan, which gives them a lot of really kind of their anti-foreigner sentiments that exists in their society because of being victims of imperialism, I guess you would say. And you could see where the Communist Party in Korea really built itself a lot on that platform, was ridding itself of foreign imperialism, which they saw happening not just from the old Chinese years, but of course in Japan, and then also that after World War II, when they thought that like the Western Allies, like the United States and stuff like that, would basically just come to do more imperialism there. But yeah, you forget a lot about Taiwan there. But yeah, Japan's gonna be there. Meiji Restoration, that is when China goes over its big modernization campaign. They basically root out a lot of their old cultural systems. This is like famously the end of the samurai and all that. And they start modernizing, industrializing very quickly. They become the first Asian nation to industrialize. And they also did it very quickly. It's said famously that, what Britain, what took them 100 years to do when it comes to industrialization, Japan was able to do in a decade. And what we usually find tags along with industrialization is imperialism. And Japan's going to be doing that. A place that needs resources, like all industrial nations, start doing some imperialism of their own. And of course, their neighbor that they would be competing with is China, where historically, China being such a big power, it was seen as like a big upset victory, at least in the eyes of many people around the world, that Japan would, defeat this big giant China, which they do quite handily. And in about 10 years after this, Japan is also going to fight another imperial power in the region, Russia, and beat them. And that officially showed that Japan, they're on the scene and they are a country to be dealt with here into the 20th century.
This time around, it was Qing loyalists that tried to resist a hostile takeover of Taiwan, and to their credit, they did proclaim Asia's first republic in the process, but they were violently put down in just under 6 months. Taiwan was Japan's first
gonna hold
colony,
on to it.
and as an eager imperial power, Japan invested heavily in railways, schools, and a public health system to show off their colonial prowess in front of the Western great powers.
Sure. You'd say this is before probably the idea of the greater co-prosperity sphere that the Japanese really, try to market in like the 1930s. But maybe this is, if you think about it, where they're kind of getting this idea, like I don't know, are they saying like they did in other places that they're, liberating the Taiwanese? A lot of those questions were not asked to the people there, but basically answered for them. You want to get rid of your imperialism, of whatever your imperial state is? Join us. But, we're not going to ask you, but we're just going to assume that's what you want, right?
In the meantime, the Manchu-Qing dynasty collapsed, and China became a republic, only for it to face regional warlordism and a communist insurgency that Japan was all too eager to exploit in the lead-up to World War II.
It becomes Japan's major points of why they are invading into mainland China, especially in 1937, was to fight the communists, right? Fight the communists of China, who were a growing threat at that time in the late 30s. Although they have not won control of the country yet. In fact, in 1937, really the nationalists, and I mean, the Civil War is going on, but the nationalists are doing much better than they're going to be doing after the war. But that was one of the sort of auspices of one of the political reasons why Japan is going to say they're going into China, is they're going to be anti-communist.
By the time Japan surrendered and was forced to return Taiwan to China, the island was already starkly more developed and wealthy than its mainland compatriots. But now that Taiwan was with China once more, they all lived happily ever after. No, just kidding.
Yep, here's the immediate
Republican
context.
Chinese government was notoriously corrupt and exploited Taiwan's resources to fight their war in the mainland against the warlords and the communists.
I think it's important to note the effect that World War II had on the Chinese Civil War, because the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek were doing pretty well. I mean, they were driving out the communists out of a lot of their positions in cities. If you've heard about, for example, the Long March, which drove out communists very, brutally, and had to go pretty much thousands of miles out into Western China and Northern China. When Japan invades, this really actually hurts the power of the nationalist government, which is kind of interesting when you think about it, because if the Japanese were there to sort of fight the communists, if that was the goal, then you think they would have been working with Chiang Kai-shek and those guys to do that. But no, the Japanese, they're fighting everybody. The communists are fighting them. The nationalists are going to be fighting them. And even with the foreign support that Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists are going to have, they still struggled greatly against the Japanese. They were unable to hold, the major cities like Shanghai and Nanjing, and left it to a lot of the brutality that you've heard about the Japanese occupation. But interestingly, the communist guerrilla fighters saw maybe a little bit more success, and alongside, I think the empathy maybe that came with the difficulties that came from the Long March made them more popular in a lot of ways. And interestingly, by the time the war is over in 45, with Japan losing the war, the script really kind of flips in the direction of the Communist Party, as Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists have been severely weakened. And yeah, like I said, the script kind of turns here, even again with that foreign support, because the big thing that, places like the Americans, right? FDR worked with Chiang Kai-shek a lot, liked about Chiang Kai-shek was simply the fact that they were anti-communist, right? And that might provide some sympathy for some Chinese people to maybe not feel as positively say about the Americans, especially if you viewed the Chiang Kai-shek government as corrupt, and now you have a foreign country supporting that, corrupt regime, adding potentially more sympathy, I guess you could say, towards that. So, World War II really screwed things up for the Chinese, and especially for Chiang Kai-shek and the future of that group's leadership in the country, because now it's not going to be going well, and they're going to be on the run.
When the mainland war turned against them in 1949, they fled en masse to Taiwan, just like the Ming loyalists 3 centuries earlier.
I can add that to my story now.
The People's Republic of China in October of that year. But just as before, the new mainland Chinese regime had no navy with which to pursue the holdouts on Taiwan.
That is true as well.
The communists weren't even able to take a small island off their own coast, which is miraculously still ruled by Taiwan today. So it was clear
Kinmen. Battle of Kinmen, October 1949. Wow. China versus Taiwan, 20,000 Chinese killed, 40,000 killed for that island? Just for that island? Can anyone tell me a little bit more about Kinmen? What's the value of that? And even today, Taiwan administrates that? I did not know that.
That taking Taiwan itself would require a lot more preparation. Mao ordered the training of a 500,000 strong invasion force and the construction of thousands of ships, with MiG-15 aircraft being generously provided by the Soviet Union.
Yeah, gonna have to have that. Now, in the perspective of like, you know, Mao Zedong and their government here, you know, Taiwan was back in Chinese hands. And if they're now the new legitimate government, they feel that that should be under their control. They don't see the Kuomintang nationalist government that's over at Taiwan as legitimate rulers anymore. They don't see that. They said that was part of Taiwan, or Taiwan was, you know, handed back over to China right after Japan is going to be kicked out. And in their eyes, they are the new legitimate government of China. Therefore, Taiwan should be a part of that. They don't see that as legitimate. And then interestingly, you flip that, the Kuomintang government, which, you know, was the governing body of China, feels that they are still the legitimate, you know, governing body of China, even though they operate in Taiwan and basically have no administrative capabilities over mainland China. They both basically view each other as illegitimate governments when it comes down to it. All right. One of the big differences, though, is you don't really see Taiwan and their government being like, all right, we're going to go take over mainland China, right? At least to not any kind of like plausibility, where China still very much, you know, talks about Taiwan and saying it should be unified. You know, you see that push a lot more than the other direction. It almost seems like Taiwan is more just kind of cooler with kind of being their own deal, especially because the, you know, the Kuomintang government is a government that came over, like it's not of the indigenous peoples that way. And I don't know exactly with the governing structure now about how many you would consider like Han Chinese that actually rule over Taiwan in contrast to like the indigenous Taiwanese people. Maybe you guys that know a little bit more about Taiwan, what's kind of the ethnic, I guess you would say, makeup of the Taiwanese government today? Let me know. And if there's anything else, any other context or perspectives, you know, from this video or any video, you know, we ever watch, be sure to respectfully put that down below so we can all learn from each other.
This new and improved amphibious army would be put to the test the very next spring in the invasion of Hainan, the other big Chinese island
so here's
that
their
was
big
still
attempt.
under control by the Republican holdouts.
Wow, they're using junk ships. So junk ships are the old trade ships that are old, very outdated ships. It was one of the problems when in, you know, 1895, when they were fighting the Japanese, where Japan had basically these modern cruiser ships and the Chinese still using junk ships. Junk ships were especially, they were trade ships, and they were very useful back in like Age of Exploration days and stuff like that. You could fit a lot of stuff, and you would, you know, be able to fortify them a little bit and arm them, but they're nothing in comparison to even early 20th century ships.
Time around,
Let's go back.
Still under control by the Republican holdouts. This time around, the invasion was a resounding success. Over 100,000 men crossed the Chongzhou Strait and secured Hainan in 2 weeks with relatively few casualties.
Down there, yeah.
What was even more emboldening for Mao was the total lack of any reaction by the United States, who had, up until then, provided the Republicans with massive loans and military equipment.
Mm-hmm. Well, that government, though, the nationalist government, the Chiang Kai-shek government, they didn't rule over Hainan, right? Is that why there wasn't much of a foreign support? Now, Taiwan itself, isn't that a different story?
America had made it clear in January 1950 that Japan and the Philippines were within its protective umbrella, but Taiwan and Korea were conspicuously left unmentioned. This convinced Mao that
well, I wouldn't say that, because those are going to be states very, very much propped up by the United States. It wasn't just like they're vacant with no intervention. No.
Were conspicuously left unmentioned. this convinced Mao that the
And maybe in that
Americans
speech,
had written
but-
off Republican China. And so he ordered the invasion of Taiwan to commence in the summer of 1950.
Okay.
But just as final preparations were underway, Kim Il-sung of North Korea decided to initiate his own invasion plans
Korean War.
of South Korea, with Stalin's blessing and with the same expectation that the US would not intervene.
I'm interested to see what the connection's going to be here. Like, what is this invasion of North Korea into South Korea going to have to do with an invasion of Taiwan here? My hypothesis would be that it would then hurt Soviet support. And in a lot of ways, the Soviets end up kind of not going all in with North Korea. They kind of leave it to China. So China really becomes the big pushers into North Korea. So I'm thinking, yeah, both China and Soviet Union are going to be much more focused on Korea here.
Unfortunately for Kim and for Mao, the US did intervene.
Right.
The fear of a communist Korea being used as a springboard against Japan was simply too great.
Remember, there was a division of the Korean Peninsula, right? Similar to other things, you're going to get other splits, basically to avoid conflict with the Soviets, especially, split up Korea. Eventually, as you guys know, there's going to be a split up of, there's going to be Germany and there's Berlin and Vietnam. The UN and stuff was really doing that. You're going to get that with 48, like Palestine, Israel. It's like split. The interesting thing about all these places that basically had these splits is they all turn into wars.
And so
it's like it looks good on paper, but then actually in execution, and actually it voids a lot of, I think, the indigenous kind of perspective out there, and becomes problematic in all of those situations.
used as a springboard against Japan was simply too great. And so President Truman backtracked on America's
He wrote a
non-intervention
segue.
policy by sending the 8th
Truman
Army
Doctrine.
to protect South Korea, and by ordering the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait to prevent any further expansion by
That's where it
communist
sits,
China.
basically.
With Taiwan now under the American defense umbrella, all hopes of invasion were off. The long standoff had begun, and although America's reasons for protecting Taiwan have changed over the years, its guarantee
Yeah, microprocessors. One of the biggest things the U.S. imports is that. It's a huge industry for Taiwan. Could be very problematic if foreign countries stop buying those. You've heard about that, maybe even talked about with like tariff discussions, potentially about like Taiwan and what that would do to like the Taiwanese economy.
hasn't wavered so far. And as odd as it may sound, the man we have to thank for all this is Kim Il-sung, as without the Korean War, the US would have probably let Taiwan fall, just like it had done with Hainan.
Do you think that's the case? I never really considered it that way. It made the connection between the two. And maybe I'm wrong just about what the policy was at that time. But I had kind of been under the impression that, yeah, like whatever happens in Korea would kind of be regardless, wouldn't change things for Taiwan. What do you guys think about that, about the connection he's making between the Korean War and that leading to the decision of going way down to Taiwan? Taiwan's not close to Korea. So the United States, bolstering that. I just figured that since that government was remnants of an American supported government, that this Taiwan was basically going to be, regardless of what happens in Korea, basically a new allied nation, I guess you would say, for the Americans to deal with. So am I wrong on that one?
In any case, I want to thank you, my friends, for watching. If you enjoyed our brief but exciting tour of Taiwan's survival, consider supporting us on Patreon so that we too can survive
patrons.
any
Love my
overwhelming
patrons. Thank you guys so
invasions
much.
by the YouTube algorithm.
Love you guys.
Also, be sure to check out the free online PvP strategy game of our friends
yeah.
over at Supremacy World War III.
the war
Follow
of
the link in
Switzerland
the description within
and
the
Florida.
next 30 days to get a delicious starter pack with an Elite Bomber seasonal unit
yum.
and wage your war of global domination. In the meantime, let us know what other topics you'd like us to explore next, and stay tuned for the next improbably
Tuned.
prosperous episode
Stay
of
tuned.
SideQuest.
All right, final thoughts. All right, guys, I asked a bunch of questions out there, some, I think, clarifying questions from you guys. If you are maybe a little bit more well-versed in this, China, fortunately, I was going to say, if you're from China, what's your perspective on this? But, you know, they don't really allow YouTube there. So some of my Taiwanese friends out there, if you have some perspective to give as well, that's always good too. Would love to hear that. Like they said, special thanks to the people that have been supporting the channel through donations and subscriptions, Patreon pledgers. Y'all don't get enough love. Thank you so much. YouTube channel members, you got to see this video first. That's one of the things I can, you know, basically program as a benefit for you is all membership starting $2. You're going to get early access to all the videos, a lot of the content that's gone kind of members only, past live streams, live shows and stuff like that. So if you're into that, great. If not, thank you just for watching. We'll see y'all next time.